And so I'm going to stop sharing, and it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Cameron Burns, who's Deputy Director of the organization Mayors for a Guaranteed Income. I'm sure he'll tell you more about that. And Anna Jefferson, who is the Senior Associate in Social Economic Policy for Social and Economic Policy at Abt Associates. And their bios are in the agenda that was shared. So I am just going to turn it over to you two.
Hi, everybody. Cam Burns, Deputy Director at MGI. Happy to kick things off and to dive right in. This title deck, this is our North Star. So all Americans deserve an income floor, AKA a guaranteed income. Again, this is for all Americans who need it. And that phraseology, I'll talk a bit more about at a later slide. So first off, what is a guaranteed income? Seems like a simple question. Of course, there's not a simple answer. So first, just take a step back and run through those related terms that both appeared on the word cloud, but also just kind of generally appear in our political debates and policy debates. There are two broad terms in this space. So there's unconditional cash transfers, and then there's conditional cash transfers. So UCTs and CCTs. UCTs are cash payments to folks without anything in return. So that means no strings attached. There's no program that folks need to attend. It is truly a cash transfer with no expectations or assignments to the recipients. Conditional cash transfers are cash payments that do require some kind of continued behavioral conditions. That could be maintaining a job, that could be attending a financial literacy program, a certain amount of credits at some community college maybe. So again, behavioral conditions required and some kind of expectation or string attached. UCTs, no expectation attached, no strings attached. So to answer the question, what is guaranteed income? Obviously the definition is straight up on the slide, but it is an unconditional cash transfer, as is another term, universal basic income. But guaranteed income, there's an important difference in that it is targeted rather than it being universal, and it is not meant to cash out the existing social safety net, but rather reinforce. So how we view a guaranteed income is very much existing alongside the social safety net, and one that can be used to reinforce that existing social safety net. Obviously, Anna will talk later about kind of the history of what it means to cash out the social safety net in terms of different approaches to cash transfers. We will tackle that later. So again, guaranteed income and universal basic income, big differences. And to stick with guaranteed income, it understands that certain groups have been marginalized by the systems in place, and guaranteed income has been documented as being the more effective strategy in directly reducing the income gap, not the wealth gap, but the income gap, and boosting equity. So with that, and a quick little plug about Mayors for Guaranteed Income. So the screenshotted map is on our website, mayorsforagi.org. We are 89 mayors strong. Quick shout out, especially with Jack on the line, quick shout out to Mayor Carter of St. Paul and Mayor Fry of Minneapolis. We are chasing a few other Minnesota mayors, so if you know them, please do welcome them into the coalition. Yeah, we are handing out cash collectively upwards of 200 million through the near 50 pilots that are operating. But that is a bit about the current moment as it pertains to the movement fighting for a guaranteed income. And with that, I'll pass it over to Anna to walk us through the history of the direct cash transfer world and of course our learnings. So go for it, Anna.
Hi, it's great to be here. So I'm going to take you on a very brief spin through a long history of cash transfer philosophy and practice. And I'm going to just give you a little bit about the antecedents and then focus more on what has been happening over the last 50 years, because I think that more directly influences the conversation that's happening today around cash as a policy in the United States. So the first key takeaway is that there are many variations of guaranteed income. As Cameron alluded to today, there are many variations, and there have been many variations in political philosophy throughout centuries. The earliest antecedents that one can claim relate to social welfare provisioning and using cash as a welfare mechanism go back to the 16th century. Some people claim Thomas More as the first philosopher who wrote anything that can be an intellectual genealogy for guaranteed income. But the first person that you'll see here on the slide is Thomas Paine. Yes, that's Thomas Paine from the founding of the United States. And his bent on cash policy was that the foundation for that was that the earth in its natural and unaltered form existed for all of humankind to share in, and that the scheme of individual property ownership deprived people of what he called a portion of their natural inheritance. And so his argument was that property owners should be made to pay what he called a ground rent for the value of the land that they owned, and that could be distributed as universal annual payments to every adult as compensation for the loss of their natural inheritance. And Paine was only one of several other prominent Enlightenment thinkers that endorsed similar variations of a universal income based on everyone's innate equal entitlement to the resources of the earth. So there are, slightly different flavors of this sort of territory and resource-based argument in favor of cash for the shared welfare. I'm going to skip ahead a long time in the timeline for the sake of today to Richard Nixon, because the Nixon administration and the social movements of the 60s and 70s are where we see a real resurgence of conversation and interest in cash as social policy. During the 1960s and 70s, the Nixon administration was influenced by the thinking of Milton Friedman, among other libertarian economists who were interested in simplifying the welfare apparatus and thought that doing that through the tax code would be more straightforward than the patchwork of safety net programs that existed. And in particular, aid to families with dependent children. And the policy that they developed and then tested through the 60s and 70s was a scheme called a negative income tax. And that is basically an income minimum guarantee that's delivered through the tax code. And I'll talk on the next slide about some of the experiments that were run through that in the late 60s through the early 80s that actually tested variations of a negative income tax scheme. They were interested in using this, as Cameron alluded to earlier, a replacement to other social safety net programs. And we're particularly academically interested in understanding how using a minimum income would, and it was a phased out benefit, what effects that would have on people's incentives and willingness to work. There were simultaneously people of very different political orientations arguing for other versions of guaranteed income. And so you'll see at the top of the slide, Johnny Tillman, who was one of the most influential welfare rights organizers of all time. She and the National Welfare Rights Organization advocated a platform of a guaranteed income, really coming from the ground up, from the perspective of recipients of welfare for whom the bureaucratic intrusion and the paternalism were really oppressive, coming from the racist tropes and assumptions about whether or not they and their families could be trusted to make their own decisions about money and family composition, who could live in the house, and so forth. And so they advocated for a no strings attached guaranteed income. And it became central to national welfare rights organizing in the late 60s and influenced Martin Luther King Jr. to adopt his advocacy in favor of a guaranteed income that was the foundation of the Poor People's Campaign. Around the same time, a guaranteed income was one component of the Black Panther Party's 10-point program. Among what their points in what the Black Panther Party advocated, there's what we want and what we believe. And one of the points of what we believe was that the government should provide full employment to all Black Americans, or failing that, their willingness to do so should provide a guaranteed income. And it's the movements that, it's more this history coming from the Tillman and King and Black Panther lineage that has inspired the enthusiasm and the movement for guaranteed income that we're seeing today. But I also wanted to, much of this may be familiar for people on the call who already know a lot about guaranteed income, but I just wanted to paint a brief high-level picture of both the breadth and the depth of the history of guaranteed income as a policy. So if you could go to the next slide, I'm going to just cover at a very high level how we've learned what we've learned about guaranteed income in the United States. And I want to make sure that folks on the call are just aware that there is also a very large body of evidence from international experiences with both conditional and unconditional cash transfers. It's way too much to cover in our time today, but just focused on experiments in the United States in the last 50 years. Among the largest that you'll hear about are what's called the Sime-Dime negative income tax experiments. And these were the ones that began under the Nixon administration. They ran from 1968 to 1982 in 4 sites, New Jersey and Pennsylvania, Iowa and North Carolina, Gary, Indiana. And then the last and the largest was last of the 4 sites, but also the largest and the longest running was a combined experiment for Seattle and Denver. So that's why it's called Sime-Dime, standing for Seattle Income Maintenance Experiment, Denver Income Maintenance Experiment. And they were testing different variations of negative income tax, essentially where they phased out, where they basically increased the tax rate that you pay against your guaranteed minimum income at different rates, to learn how that affected people's willingness to work. That was their primary interest in those experiments. There also still exists today the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend. It began making payments to every resident of the state of Alaska in 1982 and still makes annual payments that are based off of the investment of resources from oil extraction in Alaska. And that's given to every resident of Alaska as long as they've lived there for a year. So that's among the closest things that we have to something approximating a universal income. I didn't say a universal basic income because basic income, but for many advocates is understood to be enough income to cover your entire basic needs. Alaska Permanent Fund dividend payments vary year by year based on how the fund performs, but might be around like $4,000 a year. Certainly not a basic income. The Eastern Band of the Cherokee also has a universal guaranteed income based on revenues from casinos operated by the tribes. And the payments there started in the early 90s, and they continue to every enrolled member of the tribe, starting at adulthood. When members first reach adulthood, children first reach adulthood, they get a lump sum payment that has been held in trust for them during their childhood, and then they receive biannual payments after that. The earned income tax credit is familiar to many people, so that's given to working adults, primarily targeted towards parents. The expanded child tax credit was another recent, essentially short-lived guaranteed income for parents. And then we have learned from the first city that has inspired the Mayors for Guaranteed Income Coalition, the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration. So on the next slide, I'm going to summarize very briefly what we have learned across this large body of work about unconditional cash payments. Because they are operating in conjunction with the existing social safety net, they do present a benefit slip danger to some of the participants. That's a very real issue, and for Mayors for Guaranteed Income is one reason that they pursue an aggressive benefits protection strategy with their pilots. We can talk about the benefits cliff questions more in Q&A, but people spend their guaranteed income on basic needs, namely food and housing, followed by utilities. The data that we have about guaranteed income really speaks back against a lot of the negative and racist tropes about what people will spend unrestricted cash on, and those myths that motivate in-kind transfers versus unrestricted cash in most of the social safety net. Getting cash reduces recipient stress and improves their mental health. Not shocking, but important to document. And in Stockton, for example, members of the treatment group who were receiving the guaranteed income, when you compare them after a year to how they were when they entered the program, they went from, on average, having a clinical mental health condition related mostly to anxiety or depression to likely mental wellness, simply by giving cash. It also improves parenting quality and children's outcomes, and we have a lot of data on that from some of these longer term transfers like the Eastern Band of the Cherokee. And we see among longer term programs that they enhance equity, not only by the way that they're targeted, but also the most disadvantaged recipients have the most dramatic improvement in the outcomes that are studied. And speaking to the findings from the Sime-Dime experiments, there's been a lot of nuance in interpreting and arguing over those findings, but the headline there is that it has very little to no effect on people's work effort. If anything, people may work a couple hours or a couple weeks less per year, or some people may adjust from working full-time to working part-time, but we're talking about a very, very small percentage of recipients who make those labor market adjustments. I'm going to turn it back to Cameron to wrap up.
Awesome. And this is a terrible slide, so I won't spend too much time on it. It can be used to kind of fuel the discussion and conversation that we'll break into. But obviously, to acknowledge that America has a disappointing, horrible, terrible history in our country of believing that poor people cannot be trusted to make their own financial choices, which obviously goes against the founding ideals of freedom and dignity. So we all know the bootstraps trope. We know that, how does Mayor Carter put it? That a lot of politicians, a lot of policymakers like to push policy based on their uncle's favorite saying. So when someone says one's dignity and personhood is inherently tied to work, the dignity and work narrative is also not very helpful, because it ignores systemic issues and access to work and pay. And then the last one, as Anna was saying earlier, giving people free money will stop them from working. Also not helpful at all. In fact, the most recent research out of Stockton's demo shows that is entirely not true, and in fact, reverse the other way. One thing that I did want to touch on briefly before I go to the next slide is that, again, in our political conversation, is the assumption that folks will just blow the money on drugs and alcohol and plasma screen TVs, pointing to a recent example out in the Southwest, where a municipal government actually proactively disabled the ability for recipients of a guaranteed income pilot to spend the money, specifically to not spend the money on cigarettes, lotto tickets, and alcohol. And those conditions that they've placed on the cash, again, proactively perpetuate a myth that folks will spend the money different than how you and I spend the money. And in fact, that showed up in the earned income or in the child tax credit expansion debate when Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, I'm reading from a header here from Business Insider's piece, told colleagues he believed parents would use child tax credits to buy drugs and people would abuse paid leave to go hunting. And that was, again, just a few months ago. And this one makes me very happy. Though the question that governs the slide is, what is the political future of a sustainable federal guaranteed income policy, especially with the failure to extend the expanded child tax credit? So when you're thinking about inflation, like obviously that hits folks who don't have that financial cushion. So I just really want to center, you've got Flaviana there, Cassandra and her kid, and then Tomas, 3 recipients from the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration. Tomas on the right actually works with us full time, but this is just a very helpful reminder to remember people that we all work for, to make their lives just a little bit better. So as my bosses always say, Tubbs and Carter, we are clearly in a moment where we understand that poverty is a choice and we can choose differently. And to appropriately close with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., "The curse of poverty has no justification in our age. The time has come for us to civilize ourselves by the total, the direct and immediate abolition of poverty." And with that, that wraps up our slide deck.